Hi, my name's Justin Schuff. I'm the founder and engineering lead at PatchMyPC. We develop a third-party patch management solution that integrates into Microsoft Configuration Manager. Prior to my current role, I was also a premier field engineer at Microsoft supporting Config Manager. In this video, I'm going to be talking about the high availability feature of the site server that was introduced in Config Manager 1806 current branch. So first thing I want to cover is what the site server actually does to understand if it would make sense in your environment for you to make it high availability. So the first thing, if we look over here and understanding the impacts of a site server failure. So let's take a quick look at this. Now, the biggest thing that I could see why most customers may want a backup site server in passive mode is because your clients communicate with client-facing site system roles such as your management point, your software update point, etc. But those site systems, they communicate any of the client data like hardware inventory, software update compliance details. Those management points would all send that data up to your site server, which is what actually processes any changes into the database. So that's probably one of the key components that I think of why you might want to have high availability. Because let's say, for example, your clients have software update deployments. You would never know if that compliance state ever changed, even if those clients had already got policy, because the state messages that get sent up to your MP would never get processed into your database if the site server ever went down. A few other things, it also runs our site component manager, which would install any remote site systems. It also manages your content library, which is how any of the content that you're distributing goes out to your remote DPs. So anything like that would be completely offline if the site server went down. So that's kind of the overview of what I think of when we're talking about kind of the site server. I'll also include some links here that goes into a few more scenarios of what would happen if your site server went down as well. But that's kind of the key thing I think of. So next, let's kind of review what high availability means within 1806 and some of the key components of it. So within 1806, it only supported a standalone primary site. Actually, in 1810, this was changed. It now can be added to a primary site within a hierarchy within your CAS or child primary. One key prerequisite here is you do need to use a remote content library, right? So that kind of makes sense because your site server stores your content library, and that's where it references any of the source packages and content that you have within your site, and that's where it comes from when it distributes that to your remote DPs. So if you were to have an active and a passive site server for high availability, it makes sense that you would have to remove put that content library on a remote location, since you would have two servers that could potentially access that. Now, within the 1810 build, so let me just jump over here to the 1810 release notes, there were some pretty big improvements here. So the first one being that in order for your site server to really have any type of high availability, we still need access to the database. So you would either need to use a remote SQL Server database that has like a cluster or some type of high availability, or with 1810, they added the ability for you to cluster using SQL Always On, so you could potentially have always on availability groups within SQL on your active site server and then the passive one that you're going to use. So in the event that the active site server went down, you could use, it would automatically fail over using SQL Always On to your passive server. So that was introduced in 1810. So that could potentially reduce what you would have had to do with 1806, where you would require a remote SQL server. You can now use SQL Always On in that cluster, and you could have it running on both of your site servers instead of having it remote. Okay. So that was the key things I think I wanted to cover before we jump right in. So I want to give you an overview of kind of how my site's set up so we understand what we're going to be doing today. Now, in my scenario, because SQL Always On is pretty complex and it would take a little bit of time, probably its own video to set up, I'm actually going to be hosting my site database on a remote site system in this lab. Now, I will include a reference link to some different videos as well as some Microsoft TechNet articles that cover setting up SQL Always On. So if you wanted to use your site database on your site servers, you could have SQL Always On instead of using a remote database like I'm doing in this scenario. And then next, we have two client-facing site systems. These are both running MPs, DPs, and subs, right? So if you wanted to have high availability for your client-facing site systems, you would want to make sure you have at least two instances of management point, DP, and software update point. And lastly, we have our current site server. So one thing I do want to cover, the reason that we have to have these two remote site systems is that within high availability, you cannot run the distribution point role on your site server that's configured for high availability. All right, so here is the documentation for that. So when we're using high availability, the site server cannot have the DP role. So in that scenario, in order to have high availability of our clients, that's why we needed those two remote site systems that are running our DP. Since the DP couldn't be on the site server, I also put the management point and distribution point, software update point remote in that scenario. So keep an eye out for this. It sounded like when I was at a few different user groups that David James was at, they wanted to make this at some point where you could basically have high availability on only two site servers, including client-facing site system roles. So in the future, keep an eye, maybe they will have an option where you can have your remote content library for the site and maybe an additional one for the actual distribution point that's running on those two site servers. But for now, you would have to have a remote site system for your distribution point, since when we configure our site server for high availability, we cannot have the DP role on it. All right, so that looks good, I think, for kind of covering the basics. Let me just zoom out of here. Now, what we're going to do is we are going to add an additional site server. It's going to be named exactly the same, except instead of 1, it's going to be 2 for the host name. So the way that I had this configured, if you followed my initial configuration and installation video, if we look at Active Directory, we have a security group that contains all of our site servers within SCCM. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and add my new site server. So here we go. That's our current one. We'll go ahead and add our next one here. All right, so there's the one that we're going to add. So I'm going to go ahead and add this to this security group. By doing that, that's going to give my new site server permissions to my system management container within Active Directory. All right, so if we go and look at that, this was initially configured when we did our site installation. So in the event that we fell over our site server, the new computer account will have all the permissions that's needed in order to actually write to the system management container of AD. So that just makes it a little easier than trying to manage computer accounts directly for this type of security. That's also going to make it easier for giving our local admin rights to the different computers that are site servers so that they can perform the installations. So that looks good. Now that I added that server to the group, we can see that we're now logged into it. I'm just going to go ahead and reboot this so it obtains that new membership within the security group that we added this object to. All right, so this new site server that we're going to install has now been rebooted after we added it to the AD security group. The next thing that we have to validate is that the new site server's computer account has full SysAdmin rights to the SQL Server as well as local admin rights to the SQL database machine. So in our case, this is running on a remote database. So if I log into that SQL Server, first we'll make sure that we have local administrative rights on the actual box in order to be able to install the site server. It will check that you have local admin rights on your remote SQL Server in this instance. So if I look at my local administrators, we can actually see that we've already gave the computer security group account of all our site servers local admin rights on SQL. Now, if you wanted to, you could of course add the computer object directly like we see here for our primary site server. Next thing, we do also need sysadmin rights to SQL. So if we look at our SQL logins, we can see, let's take a look at what we have going on here. So in our case, the computer object of the initial site server does have sysadmin rights. So we could either directly add the computer account or we could add that security group to have rights to SQL. So if we come over here, we can look at groups. Under locations, we need to look at our AD site. and we'll go ahead and find that security group for our site servers. Now within here, we could go ahead and give that SysAdmin rights. That's a requirement when we perform our installation of the site server. It does need to have SysAdmin rights on SQL. Now, if you didn't want to use the security group, you could simply go to new login. You could do domain name / computer name. And then put a $sign at the end. So I believe I typed that right. So domain name / computer name of your new site server, and then $sign to let it know it's a computer object. Give that sysadmin rights, and then go ahead and click OK. And that's how you would add the computer account directly if you didn't use a security group for your site server computer accounts. All right, so that should be good with the SQL permissions that we have to assign to that new computer account. Next thing that we're going to go ahead and do is log back onto our computer that's going to be our new site server, and we need to install some of the prerequisites that we need within our site server installation. So the first thing that we need is Microsoft.NET 3.5. So we're going to just use the built-in server manager and install this. So this is going to be under Features, Microsoft.NET 3.5. Since we're on server 2019, or if it was 2012 or 2016, we do need to provide the path, if you don't have internet access, to the .NET installation file. So this is just my installation ISO. And then in the SXS folder, we have our component here for .NET on demand. So I'm going to copy this path, and we're going to say we're going to get the source files from that installation folder to install .NET 3.5. So we'll wait for that to complete. All right, so .NET 3.5 is now installed, so that looks good. So let me close out of that. The next thing we're going to do is go ahead and open a PowerShell command prompt. And we need to install WSUS on our site server. Now, if you're not running your software update point on your site server, you don't have to perform the full installation of WSUS. You only need the WSUS APIs so that your site server can connect into any remote software update point, and it has the necessary WSUS APIs. So it looks like it overwrote that command while it's installing, but I'll come back and show you the actual command line that we ran to install only the API piece of WSUS, so we don't have to go through and do the database or anything like that if you're not running your software update point on your site servers. All right, that looks good. So the command line that we ran here, we can see just install Windows feature -name and then update services -API. That's only going to install the API piece of this. So now, for example, if I ran the command, let's come back over here. There we go. So now if we do the get Windows feature update services, we can only see that, we have the API components installed here. We don't have any of the SQL or WID components for the actual database, only those APIs that we need in order to configure any remote software update point. Now, the next thing that we need to install is remote differential compression. So I'm going to go ahead and install that Windows feature here. If we look at that command line, it's just install Windows feature. RDC is going to be the component that we need for that. All right, so that looks good. Now, since Config Manager can't run the distribution point on the site server currently in 18.10 and high availability, there's not really a need to install IIS, but I will include the command line template just in case that ever changes where you can install the distribution point on your site server in a high availability scenario. But for this scenario, we don't need IIS for that. But we do need the Windows 10 ADK. So I'm going to install the Windows 10 1809 ADK. So we have the main ADK setup. So let me go ahead and run that. We'll just leave the default for the install. And what we need is our deployment tools and our USMT. So just like if you were doing a clean installation of a site server, you do need USMT as well as the deployment tool. So we've got both of those selected, and we'll go ahead and choose to install. So that's looking good. Now, with the 1809 version of the ADK, they did split out the main ADK and then they split Windows PE outside of that. So we do have a separate install that we need for WinPE because that's also one of the prereqs. And I'll of course include a download link in the description where you can get each of these ADKs. All right, so that looks good. We'll go ahead and launch the WinPE ADK. We'll leave the defaults and then choose to install WinPE. We'll go ahead and install that and then OK. All right, so WinPE is now installed. Next thing that we want to do is make sure that our current site server is going to have access to this new site server. So under computer management, we're going to go ahead and give that site server security group that contains all of our site servers. So that would include our current one as well as this computer account that we're on here, local administrator rights. So in our case, we're going to go ahead and do SCCM_site and go ahead and add that to the local admins group. Now, if you wanted to add the other site server directly, you could add the computer account there. And you would also want to make sure that either the security group and the computer account for your new site server is also local admin rights on your current site server to ensure that they can connect to each other when they're performing installations or failing over. So we'll go ahead and apply that and choose OK. So I think that covers most of the prereqs. Now, since we did install .NET and some other server features, I'm going to go ahead and run a reboot of this machine because when we perform the new site server installation, one of the prerequisites will be a pending restart to make sure that there isn't one. All right, so we are back on our primary site server. So this is currently our site server, this one here. Now, in order for us to actually be able to install our content library and make it remote, you will not have this Manage Content Library option clickable unless you've already removed the distribution point role from your current site server. So in my case, I've already removed the distribution point role from the site server, so we can see that it does not currently contain that. If you did have the DP role on your current site server, you would not be able to choose the option under your site to manage the content library. Now, if your content library is not set to a remote UNC path, you also will not be able to install a passive site server. So when we come over here to manage, we can see our current one is local. Now we want to make this remote. So I'm going to go ahead and jump over to one of our remote machines here. And I've already created a folder called Content Library. So within here, I'm going to go ahead and share this out. I'm going to give everybody full control for sharing permissions, right? So that looks good. And within that share, I need to make sure that my computer accounts have full access to this. So I can see that the computer account for the security groups that contain them has full control over this folder. That's going to ensure that your site servers have NTFS rights to that share that we did for our content library. Now, if you're doing the computer account directly, you could of course come in here, add a new object, add computers here, and then you could add that new site server, SCCM3, server 2. We could add that directly, and we need to make sure that that has full control. Otherwise, it would not be able to move that to our remote share here. All right, so that looks good. So let's go back to our site server, and let's just validate that we can browse out to that remote share path that we're using here. There we go, so content library. Now, one thing that you'll notice, if we try to add this directly using the root share folder, it's not going to allow that. So we do need to make a subfolder within that share. So I'm going to call this content library site PR3 for our site code. So we'll go ahead and copy that path, and we'll go ahead and choose to move our content library from our local path on our site server to that remote UNC path. Now, to monitor this, if you look at your logs on your site server and go ahead and open the distmanager.log, this is going to show the component that's going to actually handle the move of that content. So here we can see that it detected the change. We can see the current source folder, and then here in a second, we'll see this kick in, and then it's going to start moving the content. All right, so we can see that it's currently in the process of moving the files. So if we come back to our console and refresh our site, you can also see the current content move status over here in the content library as well. So now if we were to browse out to that UNC path, we can now see that it's starting to put some of our content library files and migrating them over there. So for example, if we were to look at the current local path, we can see that it has a similar structure. So it's starting to move that, and we'll just wait for that to complete. In my lab, I don't have that many packages, but depending on the size of how many packages that you have within your site, this could obviously take quite some time to actually move all those files over to that remote UNC path. All right, so it looks like our content library move completed based on the log file. Now, one thing I do want to call out is that my current site server, we can see here, is running Windows Server 2016. Now, the server that you set up for your passive site server does not have to be the exact same operating system, as long as it's a supported operating system for the current version that you have of SCCM. So if we take a look, we're actually going to be running our passive site server that we install on Windows Server 2019, and we can see that this is now supported in 18.10, which is the version that we're going to be using. All right, so that looks good. So if we come back in here and do a refresh, we can now see that our content library was moved. We can see that the new location is pointing to that UNC path. So at this point, I think we've really done most of the prerequisites that we need in order to be ready to install our site server in passive mode. So coming back to my servers and site system roles, I'm going to go ahead and choose to create a new site system server. This is going to be where we point out to our new site server that we're going to be adding for passive mode. So if we go ahead and type in that computer name, we're going to go ahead and select that number 2. We're going to add it for this site here. Let's move that over. Since we've already gave the computer account permissions of our current site server, that should of course work fine to use our computer account to perform the installation. So we'll do next here. And this is where we want to choose the option to install the site server in passive mode. So as long as you moved your content library and you installed all the prerequisites like the ADKs and the different features, we should be able to install this successfully. So we'll go ahead and do next here. And then finally, what we can do here is choose the installation on our remote computer that we want to install Config Manager onto for our site server. So if I take a look at my current Config Manager site, it's currently installed in D Microsoft Configuration Manager. So if we look at this structure, we can see that I currently have 3 different disks here, right? So if we look at our new one, it's got a quite similar setup. So jumping over to that new computer that we're going to be using, we can see we've got all the same directories. But what I'm going to do is go ahead and create our installation directory that we're going to do on the D drive. So we're going to have the same installation path as our current site server as well. So I'll go ahead and copy that path and come back to my current site server. And we're going to say that we want to install Config Manager on our remote machine to that D Microsoft Configuration Manager folder. We're going to leave the option to copy the installation files from our current active site server, and that's going to be what's used to perform that installation. We'll choose next here, and then we'll choose next here. We'll go ahead and close this. Now there is a very good monitoring piece that shows the installation status. So under monitoring, if you click on your site server status, and if you go ahead and select the one that you just added and click on show status, this is where we're going to see all the prerequisite checks that are going on as well as the installation. So we'll refresh this, make sure that I didn't miss anything here. There we go. It looks like most of the checks are done. Now, if you want to actually see the log file that's performing these checks, if we come back to our site server logs and look at the failover manager.log, this is where it's going to see it analyzing the remote server and connecting into it to perform all the checks. So if you did have something that fell out and you wanted more verbose logging, you could check out that log file here to see all these different checks taking place. All right, so there we go. We just refreshed. It looks like all the prerequisites checked out. So that's going to include things like local admin rights on that remote machine that we've added through the groups. Make sure that we have SQL SysAdmin rights. So we already did that. Make sure it's a supported OS. Pending restart. So there's why we performed that restart. Here's our remote differential compression component. Here's our WinPE components that we installed, as well as the WSUS APIs that we needed for that as well. So everything looks good there. If we jump over to the preparation, we can see things happening where it's copying the installation files to that remote site server that we're going to be adding. So let's go ahead and jump over there and see if we've actually got anything showing up yet. Looks like it's still generating the package on our current primary site. So we can see that's creating that compressed package. So I'll pause a few minutes and wait for us to see some stuff actually happening on that remote machine. All right, so let's refresh here. So jumping over to our new site server that we're adding in passive mode, the first thing that we can look is we should have a log file in the root of C called SMSTS service. This is where it's going to see if your computer account has permissions to SQL. So we can see that it does, and we've returned code 1. Jumping back to the D drive, which is where the installation is going to take place, once the install starts, we should see this SMS bootstrap, and that's going to start extracting that package that was sent over from the primary site server to this drive that we're installing to. So for example, if we look at this temp folder, we can see this is the setup files that were copied over. And at this point, it's going to start performing some installations of the site. So here we go. We can see that it's already started performing some installs. Let's see if there we go. So back on our primary, we can see that the installation status is now set to installing files. So if we come back to this machine, we can see the installation taking place. So we can close this bootstrap now that we see that it extracted the package and started the installation file here. So here's the actual install command that's being run to install our site. But the actual core installation log should be back on the C drive and then ConfigMgrSetup.log. So this is where we're going to actually see all the different files and folders getting installed for our site server. So we can see all these files getting copied into place. So this will take a few minutes. I'll go ahead and pause it while this completes. All right, so it looks like the core configuration has now completed for that setup. Now, once the initial configuration and installation happens for that site server, if we come back to our installation directory and look at our logs component, within a few minutes, you should see the sitecomp.log. So this is our site component manager. This is going to go and start installing additional components that correspond to our site server. So we'll just kind of monitor this for a couple minutes and make sure things look good. If we also refresh this, we can see that we are now on our post-installation step, which is installing the executive service, which is then going to kick up sitecomp. That's going to install all the additional components and threads that run under that SMS executive service. All right, so that sitecomp.log on our new passive site server seems to have completed and slowed down. We no longer have components installing. If we do a refresh, we can now see that our post-installation is completely done. So at this point, we should be good to go. The promotion would not happen unless your site server failed over or you manually failed it over. So at this point, we're good to go. It should show installed if we refresh here. And we now have our active site server and our passive site server listed here. All right, now the next thing, if we go look at our docs, we do need to install our provider. One thing here, I will mention this. If you do have like a guide that you want to, or a topic that you want covered, probably the best way, I do post different polls out when I'm thinking of new topics based on your feedback. And usually I have a vote and a poll on Twitter. And that's a good place if you did want to follow that, if you want any type of feedback and try to, pick topics for what I'm going to cover next. But one thing I wanted to cover here in the documentation is once we add our new passive site server, By default, based on the docs, it says that you might want to install the SMS provider role so that you have at least 2 providers. Generally, the provider is installed on your site server. So in our case, if we come back to our console and look back at our site system roles, we can see that my primary, let me select that. There we go. We can see that the primary server 1, that is our active site server, also has our SMS provider on it. Now, in the event that site server 1 went down and the new one got promoted, we would want to make sure that we still have a provider that we can connect to, which is what our console uses to interface with the database. We'd recommend probably installing that second provider on that passive site server so that you could still connect. Now, one thing that I did notice in 1810, if we look back at our log files on our passive site server, it does appear to install the SMS provider. So we can see the provider log here. And even if we went into our console on our primary site server, and if we went to connect to the site, we can see that I am in fact pointing to my passive site server. And if we go ahead and click connect, we can see that it does in fact connect to the site. If we come back to our log file on our passive, we can see that the provider is talking to the database. So in 1810, it does appear that it installs the provider. But what's interesting here is that if we look at it, it doesn't actually register the provider in here. So what I would recommend in this scenario, even if it does appear to be running the provider, I've noticed if we come back into our setup, we can modify the provider configuration and reinstall it on our passive site server, and then it will appear in here correctly. All right, so what we'll do, back on our active site server, we're going to come into our ConfigMgrSetup and go ahead and launch this. We'll choose next here. We're going to choose the option to perform site maintenance or reset and do next here. We're going to choose this option to modify the SMS provider configuration. And we can see that it thinks it only has one, even though it appears that it is in fact running on the second one. So what we're going to do is go ahead and paste in that secondary passive site server and choose next here. All right, so here we go. And what's even interesting is that we can see here in our setup file, it thinks, or it can see that it already has the provider on here, right? So it seems like it does install. I don't know if this is possibly a bug in 1810. Based on the documentation that I pulled up, it seemed like that it would not automatically install the provider on the passive site server. It appears that it kind of does in 1810, like you can connect to it, but it doesn't appear to register properly. So possibly a bug in 1810, but we're going to go ahead and choose to reinstall the provider on this site. And we'll go ahead and view this log file. And this will take a few minutes to kind of go through, connect to our remote passive site server, and go ahead and get the provider installed. All right, so it looks like the provider was now installed on our server. So let's go ahead and open the console and see how things look. All right, so looking here now. So now we can see that our primary active site server now has 4 components like you would expect. And now that new one that we just added the provider on has the same exact number. We can see the provider is now registered. And of course, if we look at our console, let's just take a look here. We should be able to connect to the provider on our active site server. So we'll go ahead and connect, verify that looks good. And then we should also be able to connect to the provider on our passive server that would facilitate all the requests in the scenario that our active SMS provider and site server went down. All right, so it looks like we are now in a good configuration. We have our high availability with our active and passive site server. Now there's basically 2 ways that a server can go from passive to active. One would be you can promote it. So if you wanted to, for instance, change your passive server to become the active and your current active one go to passive, that could be a scenario where maybe you want to migrate your site server to a new computer. maybe update the OS if you didn't want to do an in-place upgrade. That could be a scenario where you want to manually fail it over. Or there's also a unplanned failover. What happens with that is if the active server is unavailable for 30 minutes, it should automatically fail over. Now, just to show you where you'd go if you did want to perform a manual failover, if you look at your sites and then look under the nodes here, this is where we can see our current active and passive site server. So look at that. So we can currently see that the server-1 is active and server-2 is passive. So if you wanted to promote one to active manually, you could go ahead and manually initiate that promotion directly here. You can then monitor that in the monitoring node, the same place that we went for the installation. So under here, if you were promoting it, you could go to show status and it would show the promotion here. Now, what I'm going to do for this scenario is we're going to go ahead and just power the current active server down, and then we'll just kind of monitor to see what happens to see if the unplanned failover kicks in. All right, so now we're back on our passive server. One thing I do want to go ahead and get knocked out of the way is installing our console. So by default, the console would not get installed on that passive site server. I don't have any clients with the console installed, so I'm going to go ahead and choose to install the console. In my case, on this passive server, I'm going to go ahead and point to the provider by default for our passive site server that we installed that provider on. So we'll go ahead and do next and install the console. All right, so let's go ahead and open that console up. All right, so this looks good. So like you would expect, we should still have connectivity since our remote database is still online. Now, in the event that you were using SQL Always On, when the SQL went offline for that site server for the first one that was active, your connectivity to the database should still be active with that SQL Always On connection if you installed that on the passive site server. So you should still essentially have database access. Your provider should still be able to contact that database from that secondary passive server that is now should be promoted here in a few minutes, I would think. So connectivity all looks good. So we'll just wait and see if that kicks in here. All right, so we still haven't been offline 30 minutes yet, but I do want to cover this point here that says during the 30-minute wait period, when there's no active site server, clients still communicate with their client-facing roles such as MPs, software update points, etc., but none of that will get processed into the database. So what I did in this example is I went ahead and kicked off some software update scans as well as some inventory scans, and we can see that they've been forwarded up to their management point. If we look at our software update scan, we can see that any of the state changes went to our management point. So over on our management point, if we look at the state message inbox, which will be where any of the software update compliance changes are currently staged, since they can't be processed because there's no site server. Just to kind of show you what that looks like, we can see details about our software update state. We can see this is the machine that did the scan, etc. And you can get details about when they're in that pending state. This is why you might want to have that passive one, because if your site server is down for a long period of time, you would never be able to get any type of compliance changes for updates, inventory, and things like that. So once the site server kind of takes over, the management point should detect that and start talking to the new one that gets promoted, and we should see these files start to process. All right, so after waiting about 45 minutes or so and noticing that nothing happened with regards to failing over, I realized that I quickly glanced over and the unplanned failover, I kind of misread that. So when you want to promote the site server in the current build of 1810, that's always going to be a manual action that you have to perform within the console, right? So if we look at the promotion, you're going to have to perform that in the console. So here's the process. So this section here about a unplanned failover, what that means is that if you go into your console and switch over a passive server to become active because the active one went offline, in that scenario, the passive server is going to try to contact the current active site server for up to 30 minutes so that it can gracefully change over to the passive and active. In the scenario that the active site server was completely offline and you couldn't power it up, that's where after 30 minutes, it will forcefully upgrade itself to the active server. So good thing I wouldn't kind of reread that, or I'd be kind of waiting and looking at that log, realizing that nothing's actually happening. So in this scenario, what we're going to do, I did power back on server 1 just so we don't have to wait those additional 30 minutes. But if you did perform this failover operation and the original active site server was offline, that's where it could take up to 30 minutes for it to actually force the upgrade to become active. So back on our site, back where we were looking, in order to actually fail this over, we're going to go ahead and say that we want to make site server 2 our active site server. So we'll go ahead and click yes on that. And at this point, if we come back here, so we're currently running the console from our passive server. So if we go ahead and open up that failover manager log, we'll see here in a few minutes that it's going to start notifying us of the fail. So there we go. So it's starting to notify the server that we want to perform a switch to make this one active. So if we come back to our site server, we look at our current passive one, we can see that it's now promoting this. So if we go ahead and look at our installation status, this is where we can see what's going on during the promotion. So I'll pause this for a few minutes while this kind of starts the promotion of our passive to active. All right, so we are currently on our now active site server, so we can see the promotion all went successfully. That just completed. Now, if we take a look at our sitecomp.log on that new active server, what we're going to see is it is going to install some additional components that previously would not have been on the passive server. So we're going to look here at sitecomp. We're going to see some additional components and log files getting installed here. We're also going to see that it's going to start putting more inboxes here to start processing our client inventory and things that come through our inboxes. All right, so I probably waited about 10-15 minutes to wait for all the different components to install on this site server that's now active. So we went through, it connected. Once it installed all the components, it went out and connected to all the remote site systems to tell them that, hey, this is now the active site server. And then if I look at my hardware inventory log, which is the dataloader.log on this new site server, we can see, of course, all those hardware inventory files getting processed from our clients. So at this point, things are looking good. This site server 2 is now our primary site server, and it's now active. So at that point, we've basically failed it over. If you ever wanted to switch back, that would be essentially the same process where we go to sites and then nodes, and then you could simply promote the now passive server back to active if you ever had to switch back. Now, if you ever did this so you could basically switch to a new site server, this could potentially be an option for that if you didn't want to do a backup and recovery. So let's say that, maybe this new 2019 server is what we wanted for our site server. If you ever wanted to get rid of the passive one that was our old active server, you could simply right click and remove the site server and then get rid of that. And then you could potentially add a new server as your passive one if you wanted to make them both server 2019, for example. So I think that's all I had for having an active and passive site server and how you would perform that failover in the scenario that you had to promote one. Now, there were some interesting topics that David James, the director of engineering, was bringing up at MMS, as well as some of the different user group tours, that could be like in a future current branch, they might make a scenario where you can have multiple active site servers to potentially offload the processing of things like state messages, hardware inventory, things like that. So keep an eye out. The high availability feature could get even more interesting, where you could possibly have multiple site servers to help offload processing of client files coming in from your site systems like your MPs and DPs and subs. I hope this video was helpful, and thank you for watching.